Hey, what's going on, guys? My name's Josh. Welcome to another episode of the Mitsu Talk Tech Talk. My guest today is Mr. Glenn Wallace from Exigent Solutions. How are you today, sir?
Pretty good.
Good. So Glenn is going to walk us through our topic today, which is wideband. Well, let's start off with this, Glenn. Let's talk about what is a wideband.
A wideband is, in its most basic form, and what most people would probably be purchasing, is a gauge and a sensor that is measuring the amount of oxygen in your exhaust. So your air-fuel ratio for tuning and stuff like that.
So why is it important to have a wideband gauge?
The wideband, in my opinion, is probably one of the most critical sensors to have when you're tuning a car. The importance here is if you're running too lean, you can melt pistons or have knock, detonation events, stuff like that. If you're running too rich, you can run into stuff like rich misfires. You can wash cylinder walls, all the oil off the cylinders. There's a small-ish window of getting that right, and this sensor is absolutely crucial in making sure that you actually are in that window. It can also be a diagnostic tool in finding vacuum leaks, fuel pumps that are maybe marginally performing or something along those lines as well.
Okay. So you talk about it being a tool. Well, what is it measuring?
So the way these work is actually pretty cool. This sensor is measuring the amount of oxygen that is in your exhaust after the combustion process is complete. So a common misconception is like a misfire will show up as lean or rich because of the amount of fuel that's going through the exhaust, and that's not entirely the case. This is measuring pure oxygen, and then this gauge or the controller in your ECU or whatever is doing a bunch of math to figure out how much air and fuel started the combustion process that produced that amount of oxygen. Now, something to note about that is delayed, that is measuring after the combustion process has already happened. So if you are doing it in the middle of a pool and you see that this thing goes to 17 AFR or something like that, it's already too late. The damage is done. It's past tense.
We don't want to see that.
Right.
So you talked about AFRs. Let's talk about Lambda. What is Lambda?
So Lambda is a little more of an easy way to view fuel ratios between different fuels. So Lambda is essentially just a percentage of the stoichiometric ratio of any fuel. So, for example, gasoline, everybody's very familiar with that scale. Stoichiometric ratio for gasoline is 14.7 to 1, and that's 14.7 parts air to 1 part fuel to create a stoichiometric burn. Now in Lambda, that's just 1 to 1, 100%, 1 to 1, that's it. And that changes 0 for every other fuel. However, AFRs change widely for different fuels. For example, methanol is 6.5 parts air to 1 part fuel. So you can see if you don't change scales very often or something like that, you can have a wide range of mistakes or misinterpretations in your tuning process if you're talking about AFRs in gasoline scale and somebody's used to working in a methanol scale, for example.
So most gauges like this one, Glenn, we can switch from viewing it in AFR to viewing it in Lambda?
Yeah, so most modern gauges from AEM and Innovate and all of those guys, you can switch between AFR. Most of them have a couple of different scales. A lot of the, I think AEM, you can do methanol or gasoline scales and Lambda. Pretty easy to switch, a couple buttons on the face and a little reading in the user manual.
So you talked about the Lambda never changes. Is that why I would want to use my wideband in Lambda as opposed to using it in AFR?
Yes and no. So it's kind of a little bit of preference. A lot of tuners prefer Lambda because it's a lot easier, especially when you're tuning multiple cars and sometimes working with different fuels entirely, to work in Lambda. Since it's a percentage of that ratio, if we're targeting 0.8 Lambda, that's 20% richer than stoichiometric. And in gasoline scale, that's somewhere around 11.8 to 1 AFRs. So it makes it easy, and it's more universal across all the fuels. So for example, if I'm tuning one car on pump gas and then tomorrow I'm tuning a car on methanol, I know that I want idle to be at 1 Lambda for both of those. It's not going to change between the fuels. I don't have to remember that, I'm working on a methanol car today and 6.5 to 1 is my scale there, and switch back and forth. So it makes tuning process a little bit more streamlined, and it's easier to talk about regardless of what fuel you're on.
But if I was using the ethanol sensor like a lot of us do in the Mitsubishi world, I would definitely want to set my wideband to Lambda because, like you said, it never changes, right?
Right. So a lot of people will tune ethanol on the gasoline AFR scale. And because of the way that this sensor and gauge is doing the math, all the gauge is doing is converting from Lambda to whatever scale for AFR you say.
Okay.
So an E85 blend, for example, is going to be 9.9, 9.8 to 1 AFR for stoichiometric compared to the 14.7 to 1 for gasoline. So if the gauge was actually reading in AFR units and wasn't just reading the oxygen and then doing a bunch of math to get a percentage, you would show that the gauge, or that the ethanol blend would be at 9.9 instead of 14.7. Instead, with Lambda, both would just show up as 1.
Okay. So it would keep you from having to basically keep an eye on your wideband gauge if you did have the flex fuel and trying to keep track of what blend you have in the car at the time.
Right, and it makes it a little less confusing to go between fuels. So, if you're reading everything in a gasoline scale and you're tuning ethanol on a gasoline scale, you can, because most of these gauges, like I said, are just converting whatever Lambda value they get to AFR. But technically that's not right and not what's happening. So if you're running 12.5 on a gasoline scale on ethanol, that's actually something completely different, and that number doesn't actually have any basis in ethanol at all.
Okay. So let's say that we are using our wideband in AFR. What would our numbers look like from a cold start up to warmed up and, actually getting ready to go down the drag strip?
So like around idle and stuff, we'll just assume gasoline because that's going to be the easiest and what everybody's most familiar with.
Yeah.
So cold start stuff, there's a little bit of a preference there. I usually somewhere around 13-ish on a cold start, and as it warms up, it'll get closer and closer to 14.7. Usually hot, I'll be somewhere 14.7 to 15.0 for idle. That's basically where you want to be, idle, cruise, stuff like that. And that's about Lambda 1. So that's where I would want to be for that. Somewhere between like 0.9 Lambda to at cold start to 1 Lambda at idle.
So I hope that you learned something about widebands. Wideband, a lot of people think it's just something that you plug in and start cruising down the road. It's just like a kind of a pretty thing to have in your car, but it's really a tool, a really great tool that, in my opinion, you should have in your cars, especially if you're making any kind of power. A wideband, absolute necessity. And, maybe some people have a fancy digital dash, but if you don't, get a wideband. They're great. They're very affordable, and there's really no reason not to have one.
Absolutely. And most modern ECUs that are aftermarket standalones have wideband controllers or a CAN bus wideband controller, and then you can start using it for closed loop fuel strategies and stuff like that. So you can really get your mixtures a lot closer and reduce the risk of being in a situation where you're going down the road and suddenly it goes lean and you didn't catch it and you're melting pistons and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
if you're out there on a stock ECU, do not be relying on the narrow band that is in your ECU. That is not a tool. That is just a guesstimate.
That only helps you at idle and cruise. The way a narrowband sensor works, it only is going to work where you're near that Lambda 1 range on whatever fuel. And it's just because it's closed in on that narrow band, as it says in the name, and it can only operate in that range. So as soon as you go to wide open throttle, most stock ECUs will kick you out of closed loop control, and whatever's programmed into the ECU is what it's going to do.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks a lot, Glenn.
Mm-hmm.